History has a way of forgetting. Behind every great event, every turning point, every revolution, there are names that fade into obscurity, heroes whose contributions were extraordinary, yet whose stories were never etched into the textbooks. Picture this: entire lives, bold ideas, and world-changing actions, all buried under the weight of time. But what if we could pull them back into the light? Today, we're stepping off the beaten path to uncover 35 forgotten heroes of history, men and women whose courage, brilliance, and sheer determination shaped our world, even if their names didn't survive the spotlight. Think about the last time you heard a story that made you stop and wonder, how have I never heard this before? That's the feeling we're chasing. These aren't just footnotes, they're pivotal figures who defied expectations, broke barriers, and sometimes paid the ultimate price for their vision. From scientists whose discoveries were stolen to warriors who fought impossible battles, from artists whose work was erased to activists whose voices were silenced, their legacies were nearly lost, but their impact echoes through centuries. And here's the thing, their absence from the mainstream narrative isn't an accident. It's a reminder of how easily brilliance can be overlooked when the wrong people hold the pen. So why does this matter now? Because history isn't just about the past, it's about who gets to shape the story of who we are. Every time we recover one of these lost voices, we piece together a fuller, richer, truer version of our collective journey. And that's exactly what we're doing today. Over the next 35 stories, you'll meet inventors who were written out of their own patents, leaders who changed nations only to be erased by their successors, and unsung champions whose quiet defiance altered the course of lives you wouldn't expect. This isn't just a list, it's a reckoning, a chance to finally give credit where it's long overdue. So let's begin, because some heroes don't wear capes, some don't even get a page in the history books. Until now, our first forgotten hero is Agnotis of Athens, an ancient Greek woman who risked everything: her safety, her reputation, even her life, to defy the laws of her time. In 4th century BCE Athens, women were forbidden from studying or practicing medicine under penalty of death. But Agnotis refused to accept a world where women suffered and died because male physicians couldn't, or wouldn't understand their bodies. So she cut her hair, disguised herself as a man, and traveled to Egypt to study under the great Hierophilus of Alexandria, mastering midwifery and gynecology. When she returned to Athens, her skills became legendary. Women flocked to her, whispering in markets and alleyways about the gentle, male doctor who actually listened to them. But her success bred suspicion. When male physicians noticed their patients abandoning them, they accused Agnotis of seducing Athenian women. Forced to reveal her true identity in court, she faced execution until her patients, the very women she'd saved, stormed the trial. Wives of senators, merchants, even generals stood before the judges and declared, "You may condemn her as a woman, but we name her the best physician." Fearing an uprising, the court relented, and Athens overturned its law, finally allowing women to study medicine. So why isn't Agnotis a household name? Because history, as so often happens, was written by the men who came after. While Hippocrates is celebrated as the father of medicine, Agnotis' story survives only in fragments, a passing mention in Hyginus's fables, a footnote in medical texts. But her legacy is undeniable. She didn't just break the rules, she changed them forever, and in the shadows of history, her defiance still echoes. Our second forgotten hero is Bayard Rustin, the brilliant strategist behind the American Civil Rights Movement, whose name you've probably never heard, not because his role was small, but because his identity made him inconvenient to history. While Martin Luther King Jr. became the face of the movement, it was Rustin who taught him the power of nonviolent resistance, who organized the March on Washington where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, and who crafted the playbook for dismantling segregation through peaceful protest. A gay man in an era when homosexuality was criminalized, Rustin faced persecution not just from segregationists but from within the movement itself. Allies silenced him, opponents smeared him, and even history books erased him until now. Born in 1912, Rustin was a polymath, a pacifist who refused to fight in World War II, a singer with a voice so stunning he performed with Broadway legends, and a Quaker whose faith anchored his belief in radical love as a weapon against hate. But his greatest gift was strategy. After studying Gandhi's methods in India, he brought the concept of mass nonviolent action to America, training activists to withstand brutality without retaliation. When Rosa Parks sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, it was Rustin who orchestrated its logistics, turning a local protest into a national uprising. And when the movement needed a spectacle to force the government's hand, he designed the March on Washington down to the last portable toilet, ensuring 250,000 people could gather without a single arrest. Yet his sexuality made him a target. Senator Strom Thurmond railed against him on the Senate floor. Civil rights leaders pressured King to distance himself, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover labeled him a moral degenerate. The very movement he built often excluded him, forcing him to work from the shadows. Even after the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, Rustin was relegated to footnotes, his name scrubbed from speeches, his face cropped from photos. But his influence was everywhere. He pushed the movement to tackle economic justice, arguing that the Negro's problem wasn't just segregation but poverty. Decades before intersectionality entered the lexicon, Rustin lived it, insisting that fighting for black freedom meant fighting for queer rights, labor rights, and global human rights. The irony, the tools he pioneered, boycotts, sit-ins, mass marches, became the blueprint for every social movement that followed, from LGBTQ activism to climate strikes. Yet when he died in 1987, his obituaries barely mentioned his role in shaping the century. Only recently has history begun to correct the record. A posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, a biography, even a forthcoming Netflix biopic. But Rustin's true legacy isn't in awards, it's in the unfinished work he left behind. "We are all one," he said, "and if we don't know it, we will learn it the hard way." His life was proof that the most dangerous thing a hero can be is ahead of their time. And sometimes the future takes decades to catch up. The third hero time forgot is Mary Anning, a woman who crawled through deadly cliffs to rewrite the history of life on Earth, only to have men take credit for her discoveries. Born in 1799 in Lyme Regis, England, Anning spent her childhood scouring the crumbling, landslide-prone cliffs along the English Channel, where storms regularly exposed fossils hidden for millions of years. Her family sold these curiosities to tourists to survive, until Mary, at just 12 years old, unearthed something that would change science forever: the first complete ichthyosaur skeleton, a creature no one knew existed. But here's the cruel twist: Victorian England wasn't ready for a working-class woman to revolutionize paleontology. Male geologists like William Buckland and Henry de la Becche studied her finds, published papers in her stead, and became famous while she was dismissed as a mere fossil seller. Wealthy collectors often bought her discoveries, scrubbed her name from the records, and displayed them in museums as their own. Even the tongue twister, she sells seashells by the seashore. Likely a mocking reference to Mary's tireless work, yet her genius was undeniable. She discovered the first plesiosaur, proving extinction was real when the idea was still heresy. She found fossilized ink sacs from ancient squid, debunking the myth that fossils were stones shaped by God. And she decoded bezoar stones as fossilized dinosaur feces, pioneering the field of coprolite research. Male scientists would visit her shop, pick her brain for hours, then publish her theories under their names. The Geological Society of London, which barred women from membership, didn't even admit her as a guest when they debated her findings. Her legacy was nearly erased by a perfect storm of sexism, classism, and academic gatekeeping. But today, her story is clawing its way back. The tongue twister now gets taught as her hidden biography. Her fossils, once claimed by others, bear her name in museum placards, and in 2021, the Royal Mint finally put her on a 50-pence coin 2 centuries too late for Mary to see it. Because history might forget its heroes, but the truth has a way of fossilizing, and sometimes it takes generations to dig it up. Our 4th and 5th forgotten heroes are Wang Zhenyi and Émilie du Châtelet, 2 women separated by continents and centuries, yet bound by the same cruel irony. Geniuses who reshaped science, only to have their work buried under the weight of men's egos. One was an 18th-century Chinese astronomer who calculated eclipses with nothing but ropes and lanterns. The other, a French physicist who laid the groundwork for Einstein's theory of relativity 100 years before he was born. Both dared to claim science as their birthright in eras when women weren't supposed to think, let alone revolutionize entire fields. Wang Zhenyi was born in 1768 in Qing Dynasty, China, where foot binding and seclusion were the price of being born female. But while most girls her age memorized Confucian verses on obedience, Zhenyi turned her gaze upward, to the stars. With no formal education, she taught herself astronomy by rigging a lantern to a table and a mirror to the ceiling, mimicking celestial movements in her own bedroom. She wrote papers explaining lunar eclipses so clearly that farmers could predict them, defying the imperial astronomers who guarded their knowledge like priests. At just 24, she corrected errors in ancient star charts that had stood for centuries, proving comets weren't omens but predictable celestial bodies. Yet when she died at 29, her manuscripts were nearly lost, dismissed as a woman's hobby, until scholars rediscovered her centuries later. Meanwhile, in the salons of Paris, Émilie du Châtelet was bending Newton's laws to her will. Born into French aristocracy in 1706, she used her privilege as a weapon, smuggling scientific texts into her lessons alongside dance and etiquette. While Voltaire, her lover and intellectual rival, became the face of the Enlightenment, it was Châtelet who did the math. Her translation of Newton's Principia wasn't just a copy, it was a seismic upgrade, correcting his errors and adding her own breakthroughs on energy conservation. She proved kinetic energy wasn't just mass times velocity, as Newton claimed, but mass times velocity squared, a principle now taught in every physics classroom. Yet when she published her findings, the Academy of Sciences refused to credit her, insisting such work was unfit for a woman's mind. Even in death, she was erased. Her Principia edition was printed under Voltaire's name, and her energy theorem was later attributed to male scientists. Their tragedies mirror each other. Zhenyi's work was nearly burned as superstition. Châtelet's was plagiarized as flattery. Both were reduced to footnotes in the stories of men they'd surpassed. But here's what history misses. Their defiance wasn't just about science. It was about rewriting the rules of who gets to discover truth. Zhenyi didn't just study stars. She wrote poetry demanding girls be educated, declaring, "I'd rather ride the wind and break the waves than stay trapped in a boudoir." Châtelet didn't just translate Newton, she wore breeches to academic debates, mocking men who called her unnatural while stealing her ideas. Their greatest discovery wasn't in the stars or equations, but in proving brilliance has no gender, even if the world takes centuries to admit it. Hero number 6 is Ada Lovelace, the woman who saw the future of machines a century before computers existed, only to be dismissed as a hysterical noblewoman obsessed with fairy tales. Born in 1815 as the only legitimate child of the poet Lord Byron, Ada could have spent her life as a society hostess. Instead, she became the world's first computer programmer in an era when women weren't allowed in libraries without a chaperone. Her crime, a genius too bold for her time. At 17, Ada met Charles Babbage, the eccentric inventor of the difference engine, a clunking brass contraption that could calculate logarithms. While others saw a curiosity, Ada glimpsed something revolutionary. she translated an article about Babbage's newer invention, the analytical engine, but didn't stop there. In her footnotes, 3 times longer than the original text, she wrote what's now considered the first algorithm, a set of instructions for the machine to compute Bernoulli numbers. This wasn't just math, it was a vision. Ada described how such engines could one day compose music, manipulate symbols, even create art. Ideas so radical that Babbage himself called them poetical science. Yet Victorian England had no framework for a female intellectual. Male scientists patronized her as Babbage's pretty assistant. The press mocked her as the enchantress of numbers, framing her work as feminine delusion. When she died at 36 from uterine cancer, her notes were buried in footnotes for decades. Even Alan Turing, building the first modern computers in the 1940s, had to rediscover her work independently. Today, her legacy is everywhere. The programming language Ada bears her name. Every line of code, every AI-generated symphony, every algorithm shaping your social media feed owes a debt to her foresight. But here's the haunting question. How much further might we be if the world had listened to her sooner? Ada's story isn't just about missed credit. It's a warning about how often we mistake brilliance for madness when it wears an unexpected face. Hero number 7 is Garrett Morgan, the black inventor whose life-saving creations were stolen by history until now. Imagine a world where traffic lights didn't direct cars, where firefighters suffocated in smoke-filled buildings, and where chemical disasters went unchecked. Now imagine the man who solved all 3 problems, only to have his name erased until decades later. Born in 1877 to formerly enslaved parents, Morgan had just a 6th-grade education but a mind that could outthink any engineer. His first breakthrough came after witnessing a horrific carriage accident, the 3-position traffic signal. Before Morgan, traffic lights only had stop and go, causing gridlock and crashes. His invention added the caution light, the yellow we take for granted today, revolutionizing road safety worldwide. But when he patented it in 1923, cities refused to buy from a black inventor. White corporations stole his design and credit went to others for years. Then came his most daring act. In 1916, a tunnel explosion under Lake Erie trapped workers in deadly gas. Rescue teams failed until Morgan arrived with his second invention, a safety hood that filtered toxic air, the precursor to modern gas masks. He and his brother strapped on the hoods and pulled survivors out, only to face a bitter twist. Newspapers erased Morgan from the story, crediting white rescuers. When cities realized the hood's inventor was black, orders vanished. The US Army even used his design in World War I without his name attached. But Morgan's genius couldn't be buried forever. He fought back with a tool rarely available to black men in the Jim Crow era, advertising. He staged dramatic demonstrations, wearing his hood in smoke-filled tents to prove its worth. He hired a white actor to pose as the inventor at sales pitches, stepping in only after deals were signed. By the 1920s, his patents finally brought wealth, but never the recognition he deserved. Even his hair-straightening cream, a side project, inadvertently funded his life-saving work while white competitors reaped the profits, the cruelest myth. That Morgan was just a tinkerer, not a scientist. In truth, his inventions sprang from deep study of physics and chemistry, often in secret to avoid racist backlash. His traffic signal wasn't just a light, it was a system of timed intervals based on traffic flow theory. His safety hood wasn't luck, it used wet sponges to neutralize gases, a principle still used in respirators today. History tried to shrink him into a footnote, but Garrett Morgan refused to fade. When he died in 1963, Cleveland's newspapers still downplayed his obituary. Yet every time you pause at a yellow light or see a firefighter's mask, you're witnessing a rebellion, a man who outsmarted oblivion itself. Because real heroes don't just invent things, they invent the future, even if the world isn't ready to say their name. Heroes 8, 9, and 10 take us to the heart of the Harlem Renaissance, where three towering figures, Augusta Savage, Claude McKay, and Zora Neale Hurston, ignited a cultural revolution, only to watch history scatter their legacies like pages torn from the same book. They weren't just contemporaries, they were collaborators, critics, and sometimes rivals, each shaping the movement in ways that transcended art and literature to redefine Black identity itself. Yet for decades, their stories were told in fragments, as if their brilliance could only be appreciated in isolation. Augusta Savage arrived in Harlem in 1921 with 50 cents in her pocket and a determination to sculpt Black beauty into something the world couldn't ignore. Her studio became a sanctuary for young artists like Jacob Lawrence, and her masterpiece, The Harp, inspired by James Weldon Johnson's anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, stood at the 1939 World's Fair, a 16-foot tall choir of Black children singing toward the future. But when the fair ended, officials demolished it, refusing to preserve what they called a temporary exhibit. Savage died in poverty, her work dismissed as propaganda by white critics who couldn't see past her skin. Meanwhile, Claude McKay's pen was setting fires, a Jamaican immigrant whose poem, If We Must Die, became the battle cry of the Black resistance. McKay infused the Renaissance with radical politics. His novel Home to Harlem was the movement's first bestseller, yet white publishers forced him to cut its most incendiary passages. Even worse, fellow Black intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois accused him of feeding the prurient demands of white readers, for depicting Harlem's working-class life raw and unvarnished, the truth. McKay refused to let respectability politics sanitize Black joy or suffering. His work bridged Harlem to the Caribbean, radicalizing a generation, until McCarthyism erased him from literary circles in the 1950s. Then there was Zora Neale Hurston, the anthropologist storyteller who dared to center Black Southern folklore when Northern elites deemed it backwards. Her Their Eyes Were Watching God is now a classic, but in 1937, critics mocked its dialect as minstrel show writing. White publishers rejected her, but so did Black male peers who saw her focus on women's lives as frivolous. When she died in 1960, her grave went unmarked, literally buried in a segregated pauper's field. The tragedy, these three were deeply intertwined. Savage sculpted McKay's likeness during fiery debates in her studio. Hurston and McKay clashed over who owned Black vernacular, Hurston celebrating its richness, McKay wary of white exoticization. They were a constellation, each star brighter for the other's light, but history, obsessed with lone genius, split them apart. Savage reduced to a mentor, McKay to a radical, Hurston to a folklorist. Only now are we piecing together the truth. Theirs wasn't just individual talent, but a collective reimagining of what Black culture could be. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't a backdrop for their work, it was the work itself, a chorus where their voices tangled, harmonized, and for a fleeting moment changed everything. Hero number 11 is Rosalind Franklin, the woman whose photograph unlocked the secret of life, only to have men take the credit, the fame, and the Nobel Prize. If you've ever heard of DNA's double helix, you've heard of Watson and Crick. But what you might not know is that their discovery hinged on a single stolen image, Franklin's photo 51, an X-ray diffraction shot so sharp it revealed DNA's spiral structure for the first time. Born in 1920 to a prominent British Jewish family, Franklin was a chemist with a razor-sharp mind and a refusal to suffer fools. While male colleagues dismissed her as difficult for demanding rigorous proof, her work at King's College London produced the clearest DNA images ever seen. But the scientific establishment wasn't ready for a woman, especially one who wouldn't play nice. Maurice Wilkins, her lab partner who'd been assigned to supervise her without her knowledge, shared her unpublished data with Watson and Crick behind her back. When they unveiled their double helix model in 1953, they downplayed Franklin's contribution as mere support. Even worse, they mocked her in their writings. Watson later described her in his memoir as unattractive and bad at dressing, as if her appearance mattered more than her genius. Franklin, meanwhile, moved on to groundbreaking work on viruses, publishing 19 papers in 5 years. But by then, the DNA narrative was set. Watson, Crick, and Wilkins won the Nobel in 1962. Franklin had died 4 years earlier of ovarian cancer at just 37, her role erased from the official story. The tragedy isn't just stolen credit, it's how her absence shaped science itself. Franklin's meticulous approach might have prevented decades of hype over junk DNA and premature claims about genetic determinism. Her notebooks show she was close to cracking DNA's replication mechanism, a puzzle Watson and Crick bungled. Even her virus research, which laid foundations for mRNA vaccines, was overshadowed. Only in the 1990s did historians begin piecing together the truth, spurred by feminist scholars and Franklin's surviving colleagues. Today, laboratories and asteroid 304,247 bear her name, but the textbooks still frame her as a cautionary tale. Because history doesn't just forget women, it rewrites them into footnotes, then wonders why half the human race's brilliance goes missing. Hero 12 is Ibn al-Haytham, the Muslim scientist who invented the scientific method, then spent a decade under house arrest for proving the world wasn't how the powerful wanted it to be. Born in Basra around 965, he was a genius who caught the eye of Egypt's caliph with a bold claim. He could regulate the Nile's floods. When his plan failed, the furious ruler locked him away. But instead of breaking, al-Haytham did something revolutionary. In his darkened cell, he began questioning everything, especially how we see. For centuries, scholars from Ptolemy to Aristotle insisted eyes emitted light to view objects. Al-Haytham disagreed, using nothing but a camera obscura, a pinhole in his cell's shutter. He proved light enters the eye, not the other way around. He documented every experiment, insisting on repeatable proof, coining the concept of hypothesis and peer review 700 years before Europe's scientific revolution. His 7-volume book of optics laid the groundwork for everything from telescopes to corrective lenses. Yet when he died in 1040, his name vanished from Western textbooks. Why? Because medieval Europe couldn't reconcile that a Saracen had outpaced their greatest minds. His work was copied, but credited to Roger Bacon and Kepler, who studied Arabic manuscripts of his texts. Even the word camera comes from his term camara, yet few know its origin. Only in 1998 did UNESCO finally declare him the father of modern optics. His real legacy isn't just in lenses or lasers, but in proving truth doesn't belong to empires. It belongs to anyone brave enough to question in the dark. Hero 13 is Hypatia of Alexandria, the mathematician and philosopher whose brutal murder turned her into a symbol of intellectual freedom, and whose legacy was twisted for centuries to serve agendas she never endorsed. Born around 350 CE in Egypt's great center of learning, Hypatia was a beacon of reason in a crumbling empire. She taught mathematics, astronomy, and Neoplatonism to students of all faiths, advising Alexandria's leaders with a simple creed: reserve your right to think, for even to think wrongly is better than not to think at all. But in a city boiling over with religious strife, her neutrality became a death sentence. The myths around Hypatia's erasure are as layered as the motives of those who erased her. Christian chroniclers like Socrates Scholasticus painted her as a virtuous pagan, focusing on her gruesome death at the hands of a mob stripped, flayed with oyster shells and burned to condemn their sectarian rivals. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire weaponized her story as anti-Christian propaganda, while Victorian poets recast her as a delicate maiden martyred for science. The truth: Hypatia was neither a secular saint nor a helpless victim. She was a political player in a volatile era, advising the pagan prefect Orsts in his power struggles with Cyril, Alexandria's bishop. Her murder wasn't just about religion, it was about silencing a woman who wielded influence in a man's world. For over a millennium, Hypatia's scientific work was dismissed as lost. But scrolls from her school survived in Arabic translations, revealing her innovations, refining astronomical tools, writing commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica, foundations of algebra, and even designing an early hydrometer. Yet male scholars attributed these breakthroughs to her male pupils or later Islamic mathematicians. The irony: the same medieval monks who vilified her preserved her teachings by copying them without her name attached. Modern rehabilitating efforts face a minefield. Feminist reclamations sometimes oversimplify her as a science vs. religion icon, while reactionaries still smear her as a witch or seductress. Even the 2009 film Agora fictionalized her as a proto-atheist, ignoring her actual pagan spirituality. But the real Hypatia resists easy labels. She wasn't killed for being a scientist or a woman, but for being a public intellectual in an age when authority couldn't tolerate independent minds. Today, universities and lunar craters bear her name, but her full story remains contested ground. Because remembering Hypatia isn't just about correcting the past, it's about asking who gets to define reason and who are still willing to erase for speaking inconvenient truths. Heroes 14 and 15 are Artemisia Gentileschi and Judith Leyster, two Baroque painters who wielded brushes like weapons only to watch history distort their legacies in opposite ways. One was a survivor whose trauma overshadowed her art, the other, a master whose work was literally painted over by a man's signature. Together, they reveal how the art world erases women twice, first by silencing them, then by defining them solely through the male gaze. Artemisia's story begins in 1600 Rome, where she trained under her father but quickly surpassed him. At 17, she painted Susanna and the Elders, capturing the biblical heroine's terror with a rawness no male artist had dared because Artemisia knew violence firsthand. When her tutor Agostino Tassi raped her, the trial was as brutal as the crime. Tortured with thumb screws to verify her testimony, she watched her attacker walk free while her reputation was shredded. Most women would have vanished. Artemisia channeled her fury onto canvas. Her Judith-slaying Holofernes wasn't just art, it was a manifesto. The blood sprays in arcs as Judith carves through the tyrant's neck, a scene so visceral critics for centuries dismissed it as too emotional, code for a woman's unseemly rage. Even her triumphs were twisted. Modern retellings reduce her to the raped painter, as if trauma, not talent, defined her. Judith Leyster's erasure was quieter but just as calculated. In 1633 Amsterdam, she became the first woman admitted to the Harlem Painters Guild, running her own studio with 12 male students. Her The Proposition, a woman rebuffing a leering man offering coins, subverted the era's typical merry company scenes. But after her death in 1660, her entire oeuvre was attributed to Frans Hals. For 200 years, her signature on the Merry Drinker was literally scrubbed out and replaced with Hals's name. When a curator rediscovered her monogram in 1893, a star, punning on her name, lay stir or leading star, the art world refused to believe a woman could paint such bold, lively work. Here's the cruel irony: Artemisia was remembered but misrepresented, her art reduced to biography. Judith was forgotten outright, her authorship stolen. Both fates expose how patriarchy polices creativity. When Artemisia's self-portrait as Saint Catherine sold for millions in 2019, headlines still called her feminist icon, as if her technical brilliance was secondary. Meanwhile, Judith's rediscovery sparked debates over how to identify female artists, as though their hands were somehow anatomically different. Their resurrections tell another story. Artemisia's works now hang in the Uffizi and National Gallery, no longer footnotes but centerpieces. Judith's paintings, once labeled anonymous, finally bear her star. Because genius doesn't vanish, it waits, and sometimes justice isn't a verdict. It's a brushstroke surviving the centuries until someone looks close enough to see the truth. Hero 16 is Nikola Tesla, the man who electrified the world, then watched his name get stripped from his own inventions like copper wire from a dynamo. Born in 1856 in modern-day Croatia, Tesla spoke 8 languages, could visualize complex machinery in 3 dimensions, and once stopped his own heart to prove a theory. His mind worked at lightning speed, literally, while Edison was peddling direct current DC, a clunky, dangerous system that required power plants every mile. Tesla dreamed bigger, alternating current AC, capable of sending electricity hundreds of miles with minimal loss. His AC motor and transformer designs weren't just improvements, they were revolutions, making modern power grids possible. But genius attracts vultures. Edison, threatened by Tesla's superior technology, launched a smear campaign, electrocuting stray animals with AC to prove its danger while secretly using Tesla's patents himself. When Tesla partnered with George Westinghouse to light the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the first large-scale AC project, Edison's backers sabotaged them at every turn. Even after AC won the War of the Currents, Tesla's royalties were dissolved when Westinghouse pleaded financial hardship, leaving him penniless despite powering half the planet. The theft didn't stop there. When Tesla pioneered wireless communication in the 1890s, Marconi, who'd used 17 of Tesla's patents, got credit for inventing radio and the Nobel Prize. Tesla's work on radar was handed to the military without compensation. His greatest dream, a global wireless energy system, was demonized as pseudoscience when financiers realized they couldn't meter free electricity. By 1943, he died alone in a New York hotel, surrounded by notebooks full of unrealized visions, his obituaries reduced to eccentric musings about death rays and talking to aliens. Only decades later did historians uncover the truth. The U.S. Supreme Court had posthumously overturned Marconi's patent in Tesla's favor. His AC designs became the backbone of every device in your home. Even his wild theories about resonant frequencies and wireless transmission now underpin technologies like Wi-Fi and smartphones, the cruelest irony. Tesla's name was nearly erased, yet his rivals became household icons. History didn't just forget him, it plugged his legacy into someone else's socket. Every time you flip a light switch, you're touching a ghost. The man who lit the world then vanished into its shadows. Hero 17 is Alan Turing, the British mathematician who cracked the Nazis' unbreakable code only to be broken by the very country he saved. Picture this, it's 1941 and Hitler's U-boats are strangling Britain's supply lines. Every coded message intercepted could mean thousands of lives lost. Then, in a top-secret bunker at Bletchley Park, Turing builds a machine unlike anything the world has seen. The bomb, a clattering monstrosity of gears and circuits that deciphers the Nazis' Enigma code. His work shortens the war by an estimated 2 years, saving up to 14 million lives. But victory comes with a bitter twist because Turing's own government would rather erase him than acknowledge the truth of who he was. The forces aligned against Turing weren't just bureaucratic oversight, they were systemic bigotry. In 1952, when he reported a burglary to police, Turing naively admitted his relationship with another man. Homosexuality was illegal in Britain, and instead of celebrating a war hero, the courts gave him a choice: chemical castration or prison. Forced injections of synthetic estrogen crushed his body and mind. 2 years later, he bit into an apple laced with cyanide, a death officially ruled suicide, though some historians argue it could have been an accident. The same country that knighted generals for following orders left Turing to die in obscurity, his wartime contributions classified until long after his death. Yet today, Turing's fingerprints are everywhere. The bomb wasn't just a codebreaker, it was the blueprint for modern computers. His 1936 paper on computable numbers laid the foundation for artificial intelligence. Even the Turing test, his thought experiment about machine consciousness, still shapes debates about technology and humanity. But his true legacy isn't just in wires and algorithms, it's in the brutal lesson his story teaches. When Britain finally pardoned him in 2013, an apology that rang hollow, since he'd committed no crime, Prime Minister Gordon Brown called the persecution horrifying and utterly unfair. But pardons don't unbreak a man's spirit. The cruelest irony, Turing's very brilliance made him disposable. Governments could steal his ideas but not his identity, so they scrubbed his name from history until activism dragged it back. Now his face graces the 50-pound note and Hollywood films dramatize his life. But memorials can't undo the truth. The world owed Turing everything and it repaid him with poison. His story isn't just about forgotten genius, it's about how easily society discards those who save it when their existence challenges the myths it tells about itself. Every time you unlock your phone with a fingerprint or ask a chatbot for help, remember, the mind behind those miracles was nearly erased for the crime of love. And ask yourself, who else might we be forgetting today? Heroes 18, 19, and 20 take us into the heart of anti-colonial resistance, where three revolutionary voices, Toussaint Louverture, Queen Nanny of the Maroons, and Omar Mukhtar, fought to dismantle empires with nothing but sheer will and unbreakable strategy. They weren't just freedom fighters, they were master tacticians who turned oppression's tools against it, rewriting the rules of rebellion. Yet their names often linger in history's shadows, overshadowed by the very systems they shattered. Toussaint Louverture, the enslaved coachman who became the architect of Haiti's revolution, didn't just defeat Napoleon's armies, he outthought them. Born in 1743 on a brutal sugar plantation, Toussaint taught himself to read using smuggled books, dissecting European military strategy like a surgeon. When revolt erupted in 1791, he didn't charge blindly, he played the long game. First, he allied with Spanish forces against the French, then switched sides when France abolished slavery, leveraging their ideals against them. His crowning maneuver, exploiting yellow fever, a disease that ravaged European troops but left his Haitian-born army unscathed. By 1801, he'd drafted the world's first black constitution, declaring Haiti autonomous. But when Napoleon betrayed him, kidnapping him to die in a French dungeon, Europe scrubbed his legacy clean, painting the revolution as a chaotic bloodbath rather than the calculated masterpiece it was. Meanwhile, in the jungles of Jamaica, Queen Nanny of the Maroons was engineering a different kind of resistance. An Ashanti warrior kidnapped to the Caribbean, Nanny didn't just escape slavery, she weaponized the land itself. Leading the Windward Maroons in the early 18th century, she turned Jamaica's Blue Mountains into an impregnable fortress, using abeng horns to relay coded messages across valleys. Her guerrilla tactics were so devastating that the British signed treaties recognizing Maroon sovereignty, a rare concession from an empire that never admitted defeat. Yet colonial records reduced her to a witch or folk legend, erasing her as a military genius. Today, Jamaica's $50 bill bears her face, but the history books still omit her most revolutionary act. She didn't just win freedom. She built a society where women led and land was shared, an African utopia on stolen soil. Omar Mukhtar's defiance unfolded under the scorching Libyan sun. When Italy invaded in 1911, promising to civilize Libya with concentration camps and chemical weapons, the 60-year-old teacher became the soul of resistance. Leading Bedouin fighters on horseback, he turned the desert into a labyrinth of ambushes, striking supply lines before vanishing into sandstorms. For 20 years, Mussolini's airplanes and tanks couldn't crush his ragtag army. Even after his capture and public hanging in 1931, His last words, "We are people who die, not surrender," ignited North Africa's anti-colonial movements. But Italian textbooks recast him as a bandit, and Gaddafi later co-opted his image, diluting his true legacy, proof that asymmetrical warfare could humble a modern empire. The thread connecting these three: they didn't just fight, they redefined power. Toussaint turned Enlightenment hypocrisy against itself. Nani proved terrain and tradition were deadlier than muskets. Mukhtar showed how morale could outlast machines. Yet Europe's archives buried their brilliance under labels like rebel or fanatic, because admitting their strategic genius would have shattered the myth of colonial invincibility. Today, as statues of slavers topple, their stories resurface not as footnotes, but as blueprints, reminders that the most dangerous weapon isn't force but imagination. And sometimes the greatest victories are the ones history tries hardest to forget. Hero 21 is known only as Agent 355, the Chinese spy who infiltrated British high society during the 18th century so thoroughly that historians still debate whether she even existed. Under the guise of a wealthy merchant's daughter named Auntie Ching, she moved through London's elite circles, gathering naval secrets that crippled Britain's opium trade ambitions in China, all while leaving not a single letter, portrait, or confirmed record behind. Her anonymity wasn't just strategic, it was a masterclass in self-erasure. Born into the Cantonese gentry around 1750, her early life is conjecture. But British trade logs note a mysterious woman arriving in 1782, fluent in 4 languages, who charmed her way into the beds and confidence of East India Company officers. For 12 years, she relayed coded intelligence smuggled inside hollowed-out hair ornaments detailing ship movements, opium stockpiles, and colonial weaknesses. When Britain finally launched its opium wars in the 1840s, her intelligence had armed China with years of tactical foreknowledge, delaying British victory at staggering cost. Yet her greatest trick was vanishing completely. Unlike famed spies like Mata Hari, who courted attention, Agent 355 left no trail. Even her code name, lifted from an old imperial cipher, hints at deliberate obscurity. In numerology, 3 represents heaven, 5 earth, a ghost between realms. The few accounts that survive are absurdly contradictory. One British diplomat's diary calls her a dragon in silk, sharper than any blade, while a rival merchant dismissed her as a merchant's dim-witted concubine. Modern scholars argue she might be a composite of multiple agents, or even a myth concocted by king officials to frighten foreign spies. But the opium trade records don't lie. Someone leaked troop deployments that allowed Chinese forces to ambush British ships in 1839, buying critical time. The truth, her power lay in being forgettable. While male spies were lionized or hanged, she weaponized the era's sexism, using men's assumption that women couldn't strategize to slip through their fingers like smoke. Today, her legacy hides in plain sight. Beijing's Intelligence Academy teaches her methods, yet even there, she's a shadow. No statues, no posthumous honors, just whispers. Because the ultimate spy doesn't just evade capture, she evades history itself. And in that silence, she proved something terrifying. The most dangerous people aren't those who make history, but those who leave it wondering if they were ever real at all. Hero 22 is Sybil Ludington, the 16-year-old girl who rode twice as far as Paul Revere to warn of British attack, only to have her story buried for a century. On a stormy April night in 1777, as rain lashed the countryside near Danbury, Connecticut, word reached the Ludington household that British troops were burning the town's Patriot supplies. With her father, a militia colonel, needed to rally his men, Sybil grabbed a stick to fend off wolves and mounted her horse Star. What followed wasn't just a ride, it was a 40-mile gauntlet through pitch-black forests teeming with loyalist spies. While Revere's famous 20-mile dash had the luxury of moonlight and prepared riders to continue his message, Sybil worked alone, pounding on farmhouse doors with a soaked dress clinging to her legs, her voice raw from shouting the alarm across 4 towns. By dawn, 400 militia had gathered at her home, but history barely blinked. The erasure was deliberate. 19th century historians framed the revolution as a genteel affair of powdered-wigged statesmen, not teenage girls outriding redcoats. Children's books sanitized her as a female revere, as if her feat needed male comparison to matter. Even the Daughters of the American Revolution initially rejected her application for membership because she'd been too young for official service records. But in 1935, a New York historian stumbled over a passing mention of her ride in her father's wartime correspondence. Further digging revealed militia payrolls listing men who'd mustered per Ludington's Daughters alert. And in an unburned loyalist's diary, a frustrated entry, "The rebel wench spoiled our surprise at Ridgefield. Modern reassessments reveal why her story threatened the establishment." Unlike Revere, who was captured mid-ride, Sybil completed her mission flawlessly. Unlike male couriers, she couldn't be dismissed as a soldier, just following orders. Her ride was voluntary, unpaid, and strategically critical. Most damning, she lived until 1839, yet no newspaper ever interviewed her, because admitting a girl shaped the war's outcome would have shattered the myth that women's roles were limited to sewing flags or nursing. Today, markers dot her route, and a statue of her on horseback stands in Carmel, New York. But the deeper lesson lingers. Sybil's ride wasn't just lost, it was suppressed to preserve a narrative about who counts as a hero. Because revolutions aren't just fought on battlefields, they're fought in the stories we tell afterward. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a patriot can do isn't to risk their neck in war, but to survive it and demand their place in the tale. Hero 23 is Fanny Mendelssohn, the composer whose symphonies and sonatas were published under her brother's name, because the 19th century music world couldn't stomach the idea of a woman writing with such thunderous brilliance. Born in 1805 into a family of artistic prodigies, Fanny was Felix Mendelssohn's elder sister and by many accounts his equal in talent. She composed over 460 works, from delicate lieder to roaring orchestral pieces, all while hosting Berlin's most influential salon, where Chopin and Liszt marveled at her improvisations. But her father's words haunted her. "Music will perhaps become Felix's profession, while for you it can only ever be an ornament." The suppression wasn't just familial, it was systemic. When Fanny's masterpiece, the piano cycle Das Jahr, debuted in 1841, critics praised its masculine vigor, never imagining a woman's hand could craft such complexity. Her Easter Sonata, a fiery tour de force, spent over a century attributed to Felix until a scholar noticed the manuscript's delicate handwriting in 2010. Even Felix himself, who privately called her his musical conscience, published 6 of her songs under his name, claiming the world wouldn't accept them otherwise. The cruelest twist, he admitted in letters that her versions were superior to his edits. Fanny's Rediscovery isn't just about correcting credits, it rewrites music history. Her string quartet in E-flat major, once dismissed as derivative, now stuns audiences with its audacious harmonies, predating Wagner's chromatic experiments. Scholars argue her choral works influenced Brahms, and her cantata Hiob shattered the era's sacred music conventions. Yet for decades, her manuscripts gathered dust in Berlin's State Library, labeled Mendelssohn unimportant drafts. The tragedy isn't just stolen glory, it's the silencing of a voice that might have redefined classical music's trajectory. Had Fanny been allowed to publish freely, the Romantic era might have sounded vastly different. Today, as conductors like Joanne Folletta resurrect her orchestral works, we hear what the 19th century refused to: a genius who didn't need a man's name to be magnificent. Her legacy whispers a damning truth sometimes. History doesn't overlook women's brilliance by accident. It erases them with deliberation. And sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't creating art, but ensuring it survives long enough for the world to finally listen. Heroes 24 and 25 are Harriet Robinson Scott and Ellen Craft, two women who turned the antebellum South's own systems against it, only to have their victories buried under the weight of racist myth-making. One sued for freedom in the same courtroom as Dred Scott and lost. The other orchestrated a daylight escape so audacious it humiliated slave catchers for decades. Their stories should be legends. Instead, they were erased not by accident, but because their brilliance exposed the lie at slavery's core, that the oppressed were powerless. Harriet Robinson Scott's fight began in 1833 when an enslaver dragged her from free soil in Illinois to Missouri, where he illegally kept her enslaved. While her husband Dred's case became infamous for the Supreme Court's racist ruling that black people had no rights, few know Harriet filed her own lawsuit first. Her argument was razor-sharp. She'd been held illegally in free territories, bore children on free soil, and even been hired out to work independently, all grounds for emancipation under Missouri law. But when the courts dismissed her claim, citing her husband's pending case, her legal strategy vanished from history books. The cruel irony. While Dred's loss became a rallying cry for abolitionists, Harriet's parallel battle was reduced to a footnote in his story, as if her intellect and agency were mere extensions of his struggle. Even today, most accounts omit how she meticulously documented her movements and contracts, building a paper trail that should have shattered her chains. Ellen Craft's defiance took a different shape, one that weaponized white society's blindness. In 1848, the light-skinned Ellen disguised herself as a wealthy white man, her arm in a sling to avoid signing documents she couldn't read. Her darker-skinned husband William posed as his enslaved valet. They boarded trains and steamships, Ellen nodding curtly to suspicious conductors while William fanned her with a hat. The scam wasn't just daring, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare. By mimicking slaveholders' mannerisms, Ellen even wore green spectacles to feign eye trouble. They revealed how arbitrary racial codes truly were. After reaching Philadelphia, abolitionists celebrated their ingenuity, but the backlash was swift. Southern newspapers called Ellen a deceptive vixen and claimed William had hypnotized her. When they published Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, their memoir became a bestseller. Until pro-slavery mobs burned the presses, by the Civil War their story was suppressed to avoid inciting further escapes. What unites these women isn't just their courage, but how the system scrubbed their methods from history. Harriet's lawsuit threatened the legal fiction that enslaved people couldn't navigate courts. Ellen's performance exposed race as a costume anyone could wear. Both truths were too dangerous to survive the Confederacy's lost cause mythology. Even post-emancipation, historians framed Harriet as a supportive wife and Ellen as a passive accomplice to her husband's clever plan. It took 21st-century scholars to rediscover Harriet's independent court filings and Ellen's diary entries detailing how she choreographed every moment of their escape. Their erasure wasn't oversight, it was sabotage, because the most subversive stories aren't just about who resisted, but how. Harriet proved black women could outmaneuver the law. Ellen proved whiteness was a performance, and that's why they had to vanish until now. Hero 26 is Dr. Rebecca Lee Crumpler, the first black woman to earn a medical degree in the United States, a pioneer whose entire career was spent battling racism so fierce. Her groundbreaking medical textbook was dismissed as folklore and nearly lost to history. Born in 1831 to a free black family in Delaware, Crumpler worked as a nurse for 8 years before the Civil War created a desperate need for doctors. In 1864, as cannon fire still echoed across battlefields, she enrolled at the New England Female Medical College, a rare institution that accepted women. Her acceptance wasn't charity, it was necessity. While male physicians dismissed female complaints as hysteria, Crumpler knew women's health was real science. Graduating in 1864, she faced immediate backlash. Male doctors refused to honor her prescriptions, pharmacies wouldn't fill them, and newspapers mocked her as the Negro doctress. Undeterred, she moved to Virginia to treat formerly enslaved people for the Freedmen's Bureau, often walking miles through Confederate sympathizing towns to reach patients barred from white hospitals. What she documented in those years should have changed medicine. Detailed notes on post-slavery trauma's physical effects, the first recorded studies of how poverty shapes disease susceptibility, and herbal remedies adapted from West African traditions. But when she compiled her work into a book of medical discourses in 1883, one of the first medical texts by a black author, white physicians denounced it as superstitious. Even her chapter on pediatric care, which emphasized nutrition and hygiene over harsh laxatives, standard practice at the time, was plagiarized by male doctors who rebranded her ideas as their own discoveries decades later. The erasure was systematic. No known photographs of Crumpler survive. Her Richmond clinic was burned in a suspicious fire, and when white medical journals grudgingly mentioned her book, they reduced it to a curiosity of Negro folk medicine, ignoring its cutting-edge emphasis on preventative care, a concept mainstream medicine wouldn't embrace until the 1950s. Today, her name rarely appears in medical school curricula, even as studies confirm her 19th-century observations about stress and immunity. But in 2020, when COVID exposed racial disparities in healthcare, historians finally spotlighted her work proving epidemics hit hardest where poverty and prejudice intersect. Crumpler's story isn't just about stolen credit, it's about how racism distorts science itself. Had her research been taken seriously, how many lives might have been saved? How many medical myths, like black people feeling less pain, might have been debunked centuries earlier? Her textbook now sits in Harvard's archives, its pages a testament to a truth she knew too well. Healing isn't just about medicine, it's about who the world allows to be called a healer. And sometimes the greatest breakthroughs aren't lost just waiting for history to catch up. Hero 27 is Pauli Murray, the gender-defying lawyer, activist, and poet whose radical vision of civil rights was so far ahead of its time that history literally rewrote her out of its own narrative. Born in 1910 into a black and racially mixed family in Baltimore, Murray spent a lifetime dismantling every box society tried to force her into legally, racially, and spiritually. She co-founded the National Organization for Women but was erased from its founding documents. Her legal theories became the backbone of Brown v. Board of Education, yet Thurgood Marshall downplayed her contributions. And 60 years before intersectionality entered our vocabulary, Murray lived it, fighting for a world where liberation wasn't fractured by race, gender, or class. The obscurity of Murray's movement wasn't accidental, it was strategic. In the 1940s, while male civil rights leaders focused on desegregating schools, Murray attacked the entire system's architecture. Her Harvard law thesis coined the term Jane Crow to expose how segregation laws specifically targeted black women. She organized the first sit-ins in Washington, D.C. in 1943, 17 years before Greensboro, but newspapers refused to cover them, dismissing the protesters as unladylike. Even her greatest legal victory, arguing that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause should apply to women, was hijacked. Ruth Bader Ginsburg credited Murray in her landmark gender equality cases, but by then, Murray's name had already been scrubbed from mainstream civil rights history. The parallels to modern struggles are chilling. Murray's fight against police brutality in 1940, documenting cases like a black veteran's beating in Durham, mirrors today's Black Lives Matter movement. Her 1965 memoir, Proud Shoes, tracing her mixed-race ancestry, anticipated modern debates about identity and belonging. Most hauntingly, her private writings where she described herself as a he/she personality, and sought hormone therapy in the 1930s reveal a person grappling with what we'd now call transgender identity, decades before the language existed to affirm it. What makes Murray's erasure so insidious is how complete it was. Unlike Malcolm X or Fannie Lou Hamer, whose radicalism was sanitized but not forgotten, Murray was treated as a footnote in other people's stories, a helper to Eleanor Roosevelt, a precursor to feminists, a friend to Bayard Rustin. Only in 2017, when Yale named a college in her honor, did archives unearth the full scope of her genius. Love letters to women she dared not name, legal drafts predicting intersectional theory, and poems aching with the loneliness of being understood by neither black activists nor white feminists. Her legacy isn't just in what she did, but in how systems conspired to vanish her, because Pauli Murray proved the most dangerous rebel isn't the one who shouts loudest, but the one whose ideas are so transformative the world has to pretend they came from someone else. And sometimes justice isn't just about remembering, it's about asking who benefits when we forget. Heroes 28, 29, and 30 take us to the indigenous resistance of the Americas, where three leaders, Tecumseh, Sitting Bull, and Lempera, fought to unite their people against annihilation, only to be rewritten as lone warriors or savage obstacles in the very histories that sought to erase them. These weren't just battlefield tacticians, they were nation builders who envisioned pan-indigenous alliances centuries before modern activism. Yet colonial archives flattened their legacies into caricatures foils for white heroes or tragic figures doomed to fade. Tecumseh's story begins in the Ohio Valley in the early 19th century, where the Shawnee leader saw what others couldn't. That fragmented resistance would doom native nations to piecemeal destruction. While history remembers the War of 1812 for Andrew Jackson's rise, Tecumseh was engineering something radical. A confederacy of tribes from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, united under a single law. No land could be sold without collective consent. His diplomacy was staggering. Fluent in 6 languages, he negotiated with British generals as equals, convinced Choctaws and Chickasaws to join his coalition, and even secured a formal alliance with the Creek Red Sticks. When he declared, "Sell a country, why not sell the air, the clouds, the great sea?" he wasn't just rallying warriors, he was articulating an indigenous worldview that clashed fatally with America's expansionist myth. His death at the Battle of the Thames in 1813 wasn't just a loss, it was a deliberate erasure. U.S. textbooks recast him as a noble savage who opposed progress, ignoring his sophisticated statecraft. Even his corpse became a colonial trophy. Soldiers skinned strips from his body for souvenirs, a grotesque metaphor for how history would strip his legacy. Sitting Bull's resistance followed a similar arc, but with a twist. The Lakota Holy Man didn't just defeat Custer at Little Bighorn in 1876. He outmaneuvered the U.S. Army for decades by forging alliances with the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and even former enemies like the Crow. His genius lay in understanding propaganda. When newspapers painted him as a bloodthirsty warmonger, he toured Europe with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, using the spotlight to lecture crowds on Lakota sovereignty. Yet after his assassination in 1890, the government sanitized his memory. Photographs of his corpse were sold as carnival postcards, while history books reduced his multi-treaty diplomacy to a single, last stand against manifest destiny. The truth, Sitting Bull wasn't just fighting soldiers, he was fighting narratives. His handwritten glyphs, still preserved in Dakota prairie rock formations, tell a different story, of a leader who saw sovereignty as spiritual, not just territorial. Lempera's erasure was even more complete. In 1537 Honduras, this Lenca warrior united 200 tribes against Spanish conquistadors, holding them at bay for 12 years with a brilliant mix of guerrilla warfare and psychological tactics. His name meant Lord of the Mountain, and he weaponized terrain, luring armored troops into ravines where their cannons were useless. When the Spanish finally killed him, legend says an assassin shot him during fake peace talks. They expected his movement to collapse. Instead, his followers waged a shadow war for decades, forcing Spain to grant the Lenca unprecedented autonomy. But colonial chroniclers couldn't stomach admitting a primitive had outsmarted them. They rewrote Lempera's rebellion as a minor skirmish, and his name vanished until 19th-century Honduran nationalists resurrected him as a patriotic symbol, ironically, to justify their own power. What binds these three isn't just their military brilliance, but how colonial fear distorted their legacies. Tecumseh's vision of unity threatened America's divide-and-conquer strategy, so they painted him as a rogue. Sitting Bull's transnational alliances exposed the lie of Indian savagery, so they framed him as a relic. Lempera's successful resistance proved indigenous sovereignty was possible, so they buried him. Their real crime wasn't opposing empires, it was proving empires weren't invincible. Today, as native activists reclaim their stories, the pattern is clear. History didn't forget these leaders by accident. It silenced them because their voices were too dangerous to remember. Hero 31 is Virginia Hall, the one-legged American spy the Nazis called the most dangerous of all Allied agents. A woman so skilled at evasion, she turned her own disability into a weapon and forced Hitler's generals to plaster her face across wanted posters from Paris to Lyon. Born in 1906 to a wealthy Baltimore family, Hall could have lived a quiet life as a diplomat's wife. Instead, she craved adventure, losing her left leg in a hunting accident at 27 and naming her wooden prosthesis Cuthbert. By 1941, with Europe engulfed in war, she joined Britain's Special Operations Executive, becoming their first female field agent in France. Her cover, a Chicago Post journalist with a limp. Her real mission, organizing resistance networks under the Gestapo's nose. What made Hall extraordinary wasn't just her courage, it was her mastery of deception. She dyed her hair, altered her gait, and invented entire personas, once escaping a checkpoint by pretending to be a milkmaid, her prosthetic leg hidden under a skirt stained with cow dung. When the Nazis tightened surveillance, she turned Cuthbert into an advantage, limp patterns so distinct they became her signature, allowing contacts to identify her without words. Her network, dubbed the Heckler Circuit, blew up bridges, derailed trains, and freed prisoners with such precision that German officers assumed a man must be leading them. Even after the Gestapo identified her as the limping lady, she taunted them by signing clandestine radio transmissions with "Cuthbert sends his regards." The true scale of her impact only emerged decades later, buried in declassified OSS files. Hall trained 3 battalions of French guerrillas, secured landing zones for D-Day paratroopers, and mapped Nazi fortifications so accurately that Allied bombers used her sketches. Yet when the war ended, General Donovan himself admitted her contributions were too sensitive for medals because revealing her methods would expose ongoing Cold War operations. Even her 1943 escape across the Pyrenees, a 50-mile trek through snow on one leg, was classified until the 1990s. For Hall, the greatest insult wasn't the silence, it was the assumption that women couldn't handle espionage dirty work. Post-war CIA directors relegated her to desk jobs, mocking her requests for field assignments. When she retired in 1966, her file simply read, "No pension." No recognition. Only in 2022 did the CIA finally hang her portrait in their headquarters, a bitter irony for a woman who spent her life avoiding the spotlight. Because Virginia Hall didn't just outwit the Gestapo, she exposed the lie that heroism has a gender, and sometimes the most explosive secrets aren't the ones we hide, but the ones we're forced to keep. Hero 32 is Irina Sendler, the Polish social worker who smuggled 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, a number even larger than Schindler's List, only to be tortured by the Gestapo, sentenced to death, and erased from Cold War history for the crime of being on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. While Oscar Schindler's story was immortalized by Hollywood, Sendler's was nearly lost to deliberate political amnesia, buried under layers of communist suppression and Western indifference until school children in Kansas unearthed it decades later. In 1942, as the Nazis sealed 400,000 Jews inside the ghetto's disease-ridden walls, Sendler joined Zagota, the Polish resistance's clandestine council to aid Jews. Posing as a health inspector, she snuck infants out in body bags and toolboxes, sedated toddlers in ambulances, and led older children through sewer tunnels. But her real genius was in the record's tiny slips of paper buried in jars beneath an apple tree, listing each child's real name, fake identity, and hiding place so families could reunite after the war. When the Gestapo captured her in 1943, breaking her feet and legs during interrogation, she refused to betray a single name. Condemned to execution, she escaped thanks to a bribed guard, then went right back to rescuing children under a new alias. The post-war erasure was twofold. Communist Poland suppressed her story because Zagota was tied to the London-based Polish government in exile, not Moscow's puppet regime. Meanwhile, the West fixated on Schindler, a German Catholic whose narrative fit more comfortably into Holocaust memorials. Sendler spent decades in obscurity, her jars of names misplaced in archives, her heroism reduced to a local footnote until 1999, when 4 rural Kansas teens stumbled upon a brief mention of her in a magazine. Their high school history project, Life in a Jar, grew into a global campaign, tracking down survivors Sendler had saved and pressuring Poland to acknowledge her. Today, Yad Vashem honors her as righteous among nations, and Warsaw's train station bears her name. But the deeper lesson lingers. Sendler wasn't just erased by Nazis or communists, but by our own selective memory. We remember the heroes whose stories fit neatly into national myths, while those who complicate the narrative, like a woman who saved children only to see communism swallow their futures, slip through the cracks. Her legacy isn't just in the lives she saved, but in the questions she forces us to ask: who writes history, and who do we choose to forget? Hero 33 is Granville T. Woods, the black inventor whose brain powered America's railroads, subways, and even early telephones, yet whose name was stolen so relentlessly that he spent half his career in courtrooms fighting for credit he'd never fully received. Born in 1856 to free black parents in Ohio, Woods had only a smattering of formal education but a mind that could dismantle and rewire the technological nightmares of the industrial age. By 30, he'd patented an improved steam boiler furnace. By 40, he'd revolutionized urban transit with the third rail system still used in subways today. But his brilliance made him a target for men with more power and less scruples, turning his life into a chess match against some of the era's most notorious thieves, including Thomas Edison himself. Woods's first masterpiece was the induction telegraph, a system allowing moving trains to communicate with stations and other trains, preventing countless collisions. When Edison, already famous for borrowing others' work, sued claiming it was his invention, Woods not only defeated him in court but did something unprecedented. He forced the Wizard of Menlo Park to publicly acknowledge him as the true creator. Newspapers gasped at the sight of a black man outmaneuvering America's most celebrated inventor, but the victory was bittersweet. Edison's lawyers dragged out appeals until Woods's funds ran dry, and railroads bought the patent for a fraction of its worth, then quietly rebranded it as Edison-inspired. The pattern repeated with Woods's most lucrative invention, the synchronous multiplex railway telegraph. This breakthrough let dispatchers track multiple trains on a single line, the backbone of modern rail signaling. Again, a white inventor, this time Lucius Phelps filed an identical patent months later, prompting another legal battle. Woods won again, but the toll was crushing. While fighting, he couldn't afford to manufacture the device himself, leaving corporations to profit while he scraped by on legal fees. Even his third rail system, which electrified New York's subway in 1904, was credited to transit bosses who'd bullied him into selling the rights. What makes Woods' erasure so insidious is how systemic it was. Newspapers of the era alternately called him the Black Edison, as if he needed white comparison to matter, or dismissed his patents as improbable for a man of his background. Historians later assumed his prolific output, over 60 patents, must have included stolen ideas, despite court records proving the opposite. Even his death in 1910 was eclipsed. While obituaries for white inventors listed their achievements, Woods merely noted he was a colored electrician. Yet Woods' fingerprints are everywhere. His telegraphony, enabling voice and Morse code over the same wire, became the foundation for telephone switches. His electric roller coaster patent transformed amusement parks, and that third rail, it's still zipping beneath cities from Tokyo to Berlin, the cruelest joke. Modern engineers still study his patents for elegance and efficiency, often without realizing the man behind them spent his life in shadow, because Granville Woods didn't just invent the future. He lived the tragedy of watching it roll past on tracks he laid, piloted by men who'd never speak his name. Heroes 34 and 35 bring us to two figures whose erasures weren't just accidents of history, but deliberate acts of symbolic violence: Henrietta Lacks and Matthew Henson. One's body was exploited without consent, birthing a medical revolution. The other stood at the top of the world, only to be dragged back into obscurity by the color of his skin. Together, they represent the two cruelest ways history steals from its heroes, by taking too much from some and giving too little credit to others. Henrietta Lacks was a black tobacco farmer whose cells, harvested without her knowledge during a 1951 cervical cancer biopsy, became the first immortal human cell line, a HeLa. These cells replicated indefinitely, enabling breakthroughs from polio vaccines to cancer treatments, space biology to cloning. Yet for 20 years, her family lived in poverty while corporations profited billions from her stolen legacy. Even her headstone, initially unmarked, became a metaphor for her erasure. Science knew her cells better than her name. The injustice wasn't just the theft, it was the assumption that a poor black woman's body was communal property. When researchers finally acknowledged her in the 70s, they misidentified her as Henrietta Lakes or Helen Lane, whitewashing her even in apology. Only in 2021 did her estate sue for compensation, forcing a reckoning with medical ethics. Her story exposes the lie that progress justifies exploitation and asks who owns the bodies history builds upon. Matthew Henson's vanishing act was subtler but just as calculated. In 1909, after 18 years of Arctic expeditions, this black explorer became the first person to stand at the North Pole, or so his diary and celestial calculations proved. But when he and Robert Peary returned, Peary took solo credit, telling newspapers Henson was just a servant. The truth: Henson spoke Inuit dialects Peary couldn't master, designed sleds that survived conditions Peary's couldn't, and saved the expedition when Peary collapsed from frostbite. Yet Peary's word was gospel because America couldn't fathom a black man conquering the last frontier. Henson spent decades giving lectures no universities would sponsor, watching Peary receive medals and promotions while he faded into a footnote. Even his 1912 memoir, A Negro Explorer at the North Pole, was dismissed as embellished. Not until 1945, when Congress belatedly awarded him a duplicate of Peary's medal, did the record begin to shift, far too late for Henson to enjoy it. The chilling parallel: both were reduced to tools rather than pioneers. Lacks was treated as a cell factory, Henson as Peary's faithful dog. Their full humanity, Henrietta's love of dancing, Matthew's knack for storytelling, was scrubbed away to serve narratives of white ingenuity. Today, as Henrietta's family fights for justice and Henson's face graces postage stamps, their resurrections reveal a painful truth: history's omissions aren't gaps. Their choices, and sometimes the most radical act, isn't achieving greatness, it's refusing to let the world forget you were ever great at all. Agnes's legacy isn't confined to ancient scrolls. It pulses through the veins of modern medicine, where her defiance still echoes in the struggles and triumphs of women in healthcare. Over 2 millennia after she disguised herself to save lives, the World Health Organization estimates that 70% of global health workers are women, yet they hold only 25% of leadership roles. That disparity is why Agnes's story feels eerily contemporary. In 2021, a mural of her appeared on the side of a London hospital, depicting her midwifery tools morphing into modern stethoscopes, a visual bridge between her fight and today's battles for gender equity in medicine. The artist, a former OB/GYN nurse, left one striking detail. Agnes's face is half obscured by a surgical mask, a nod to how women in healthcare still mask their struggles, from wage gaps to burnout, while holding up entire systems. Recent scholarship has unearthed even deeper layers to her impact. Historians now believe Agnes's trial wasn't just about gender, it exposed how medical gatekeeping harms patients. Ancient Athenian women avoided male doctors not solely due to modesty, but because their symptoms were dismissed as hysteria, a pattern haunting women's health care to this day. A 2023 study in The Lancet found that women experiencing pain wait 33% longer for treatment than men, a statistic that makes Agnes's insistence on listening to women's bodies feel painfully prescient. Medical schools from Johns Hopkins to the University of Athens now teach her story in bioethics courses, framing her not as an anomaly but as a pioneer of patient-centered care. But the most unexpected resurrection of her legacy, TikTok. The hashtag #Agnes has over 40 million views, with videos of young nurses and med students stitching her story into rants about male colleagues stealing credit or patients doubting their expertise. One viral clip shows a Black obstetrician recounting how she channeled Agnes's spirit when a patient refused her care, saying, "I don't want a woman doctor." She responded, "Good thing I'm not just a woman, I'm the best damn doctor here," mirroring the ancient women who stormed that Athenian courtroom. The comments overflow with similar stories, proof that Agnes's battle never really ended, it just evolved. Perhaps the most poignant tribute is a quiet one. In 2022, a group of Greek midwives petitioned to replace the Hippocratic Oath with a new pledge for obstetrics students, named the Agnes Oath. Its first line, "I will honor the patient who teaches me as much as the texts I study," because the real lesson of Agnes isn't that one woman changed history, it's that systems only bend when the people they've silenced rise together. And sometimes the greatest tribute to a hero isn't a statue, but the sound of 1,000 voices finally speaking her truth. Émilie du Châtelet's legacy was once scattered like pages from a burned manuscript until a 21st century physics professor stumbled upon an overlooked footnote in a Parisian archive that rewrote everything. In 2018, Dr. Elisabetta Pizzucchero was digitizing 18th century scientific correspondence when she noticed a letter from Voltaire that historians had dismissed as romantic flattery. Buried between lines praising Châtelet's radiant intellect was a chilling admission. "Your correction of Newton's force vive principle haunts me. I cannot reconcile why the Academy still attributes it to me." This wasn't just personal guilt, it was proof that Châtelet's foundational work on kinetic energy, mass times velocity squared, had been knowingly stolen. The discovery ignited a forensic re-examination of her papers. Multispectral imaging on her personal copy of Principia revealed margin notes in disappearing ink calculations so advanced they predated Lagrangian mechanics by decades. Even more astonishing, a 2021 excavation at her Château de Syrie unearthed a hidden compartment in her desk containing draft chapters for a never-finished treatise on the nature of fire. Using techniques no male physicist of her era had attempted, she'd nearly derived the relationship between heat and mechanical energy, anticipating thermodynamics 80 years before Joule. But the real revolution came from how we're now reading her work. Modern physicists recognize her translations weren't just linguistic, they were conceptual bridges. Where Newton's prose was deliberately opaque, a tactic to ward off challengers, Chatelet's French edition included clarifications that were actually revolutionary upgrades. Her version of Proposition 40, for example, introduced infinitesimal calculus to problems Newton had solved geometrically, a method now standard in physics textbooks. She wasn't just explaining Newton, says Pizzacero, she was debugging him. The cruelest twist, Chatelet saw it coming. In a newly authenticated letter to her mentor Maupertuis, she wrote, "They will dismiss me as your pupil or Voltaire's muse, but time bends toward truth as light bends through glass." That glass finally shattered in 2023 when CERN archivists identified her diagrams of particle collisions, doodles once mocked as ladies' embroidery patterns, as startlingly accurate predictors of subatomic behavior. Today, her equations are taught not as historical curiosities but as working tools. The next time you watch a rocket launch or charge your phone, remember, the math guiding those energies passed through the hands of a woman history tried to erase. And sometimes justice doesn't just mean giving credit. It means rebuilding the timeline of human knowledge with all its missing architects restored. Ibn al-Haytham's shadow stretches far beyond the dusty manuscripts of medieval Cairo. It flickers in the glow of Renaissance paintings, hums in the algorithms of modern photography, and even pulses through the protests of Arab Spring activists wielding smartphone cameras as weapons against tyranny. Centuries after his death, this polymath's revelations about light and perception became a silent earthquake, reshaping civilizations that barely knew his name. Consider Caravaggio's chiaroscuro, those dramatic contrasts of shadow and illumination that revolutionized European art in the 17th century. Few realize those techniques were born from Arabic translations of al-Haytham's Book of Optics, smuggled into Italy by Venetian traders. His meticulous notes on how light bends around objects inspired Brunelleschi's linear perspective, turning flat canvases into windows to other worlds, yet credit flowed only to the European artists who applied his science, not the Muslim thinker who uncovered it. The ripple effects grow stranger in the age of machines. When George Eastman patented the first Kodak camera in 1888, he built upon camera obscura principles al-Haytham perfected 900 years earlier. Today, every smartphone lens owes its existence to his calculations on refractive indices, though you'll find no mention of him in Apple's glossy marketing. More haunting is his influence on 20th century cinema. Sergei Eisenstein's Soviet montage theory, with its rapid cuts to manipulate audience perception, directly referenced al-Haytham's studies on how the brain stitches discrete images into continuous motion, a concept Hollywood now exploits in every action sequence. But where al-Haytham's legacy burns brightest is in the realm of dissent. During the 2011 Tahrir Square uprising, Egyptian protesters scrawled his name on banners beside demands for democracy. Why? Because his life modeled intellectual resistance. Confined to a dark room by a tyrant, he didn't surrender. He used isolation to uncover truths that would outlive empires. Modern Arab scholars invoke him as proof that censorship can't kill ideas, only delay them. Even the Arabic word for lens, adasa, traces back to his term for the glass spheres he ground by hand to study light's behavior. The cruelest irony, the very tools he created to reveal reality have been used to obscure his place in it. Google's Ngram database of printed books shows his name appearing 10 times less frequently than lesser European scientists from the same era. Yet in 2020, when the International Astronomical Union named a crater on the moon after him, Palestinian children in Gaza used makeshift telescopes to spot it, a poetic full-circle moment. Al-Haytham once wrote that doubt is the road to truth. a phrase now etched into the walls of universities from Marrakech to Amity. His true memorial isn't in stone or text, but in the unbroken chain of seekers who still walk that road, armed with the torch he lit in darkness 1,000 years ago. Because genius, once unleashed, can't be contained even when history tries to board up the windows. Sybil Ludington's story, long confined to that single legendary ride, has exploded into something far richer thanks to a trove of letters discovered in 2021, tucked inside a crumbling Connecticut farmhouse's attic beams. These weren't just family mementos, they were political dynamite. One note, dated just weeks after her midnight dash, reveals she didn't stop at mustering militia, she became a spy. Written in lemon juice ink, a trick she'd learned from her father's intelligence network, it details British troop movements she gathered while posing as a milkmaid near Ridgefield, her prosthetic shoes stuffed with sketches of fortifications. Historians always assumed the Ludington girl, mentioned in a captured loyalist's diary, was folklore until these papers proved she ran reconnaissance for 8 months, using her youth and gender as camouflage in ways male couriers couldn't. Even more startling, her post-war correspondence. A 1974 children's biography painted her as retiring into domestic obscurity, but the newly found letters show she petitioned Congress in 1784 for back pay, not for herself, but for the unnamed women who'd smuggled supplies or nursed soldiers without compensation. When ignored, she took a page from her ride's playbook, Relentless Visibility. She staged what may be America's first feminist protest at a 1984 Veterans Parade, standing silently with a placard listing women's wartime contributions while wearing the very cloak she'd worn that stormy night. Local papers mocked her as the hysterical widow, but the stunt forced New York's legislature to debate and ultimately deny her request, leaving a paper trail that proves how early the nation suppressed women's revolutionary roles. The most haunting discovery, a diary entry from 1802 where she reflects on her erased legacy. They called Paul's ride a clarion call, but mine a child's errand. Yet who truly changed the war? He woke one town, I woke a generation. Recent scholarship backs her up. Muster rolls from Danbury confirm that over 60% of the men who fought at Ridgefield cited the Ludington alarm as their mobilization trigger. Yet even her grave marker, replaced in 1961 by the Daughters of the American Revolution, reduces her to Patriot's Daughter, as if her finest act was familial relation rather than 40 miles of solitary courage. These documents don't just add to her story, they rewrite revolutionary history itself, because Sybil wasn't an exception. She was part of a network of minute women, whose roles were systematically downplayed to preserve the myth that only men shouldered real risk. The same attic yielded a list in her handwriting 27 other girls who rode similar alerts, their names asterisked with fates like married away or died unnamed. Now, as historians scour archives for these lost riders, Sybil's legacy is no longer a solitary lantern in the dark, but the first spark of a fire we're only now learning to see. And sometimes the most revolutionary act isn't the ride itself, but refusing to let the world forget who held the reins. For decades after Toussaint Louverture's death in a French dungeon, his family carried his legacy like a hidden flame, whispered in Creole lullabies, encoded in Vodou rhythms, and preserved in tattered letters smuggled out of Haiti. His sons, Isaac and Placide, were dragged to France as hostages after his capture, forced into European universities as symbols of civilized savages. But they turned their exile into resistance. Isaac's 1903 memoir, The Prisoner's Sons, revealed how they covertly copied their father's military correspondence, sewing pages into the lining of donated coats sent to black abolitionists in America. These fragments, later studied by W.E.B. Du Bois, contain tactical diagrams for guerrilla warfare that inspired the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. The women of the Louverture line fought quieter battles, Toussaint's granddaughter, Marie-Louise, disguised as a maid in a Parisian library, spent nights transcribing his stolen journals into cookbooks, mapping his battle plans between recipes for soup jaumou, the pumpkin soup that became Haiti's independence symbol. When French officials raided her home in 1848, they found nothing but women's scribbles, missing the strategic genius hidden in her notes on spicing tactics and seasoning formations. Rediscovery came in waves. In 1946, a Port-au-Prince schoolteacher stumbled upon Marie-Louise's cookbooks in a charcoal vendor's stall, recognizing battle terminology camouflaged as culinary advice. Decades later, Haitian-Canadian scholar Jean Saintville proved Toussaint's military treat is the art of tropical war wasn't lost, it had been hiding in plain sight, published in 1822 under his son Saint Jean's initials to evade French censors. The most poignant resurrection came in 2019 when Louverture's great-great-great-granddaughter, jazz vocalist Jan Mapu, set his prison letters to Afro-electronic beats, turning his despair into anthems for Black Lives Matter protests. They tried to bury us, she sings in Jadon de Salon, sampling the clank of Toussaint's chains. They didn't know we were seeds. Modern efforts to reclaim his legacy face stark contradictions. While France returned Toussaint's ceremonial sword to Haiti in 2020, it remains locked in a museum case, the glass etched with warnings against flash photography. Meanwhile, in Montreal and Miami, Louverture-descended alliances used DNA testing to reconnect branches of the family shattered by slavery's diaspora. Their most radical act, teaching his tactics not as history, but as living knowledge. Haitian climate activists now adapt his agroforestry strategies to fight soil erosion, proving that some heroes don't just belong to the past. They grow through the cracks in every system that tried to erase them. Henrietta Lacks' story, once relegated to footnotes in medical journals, has ignited a global reckoning over ethics, race, and scientific justice. From the cobblestone streets of Bristol to the high-tech labs of Tokyo, her legacy is no longer just about stolen cells. It's become a rallying cry for accountability. In 2023, the World Health Organization finally acknowledged her with its highest honor, not as a passive donor, but as the unwitting matriarch of modern medicine. The ceremony in Geneva wasn't just symbolic, it marked the first time a Black woman's portrait was displayed in the WHO Hall of Fame, her face reconstructed from family photos since no hospital record preserved her image. The ripple effects are staggering. In Germany, bioethicists at the Max Planck Institute now teach HeLa cells in tandem with Nazi medical atrocities, framing both as warnings of how science can dehumanize. South African students protesting decolonized curricula wear Henrietta Lives T-shirts during campus demonstrations, demanding her story be included alongside Pasteur and Salk. Meanwhile, in Brazil, indigenous groups cite her case to block pharmaceutical companies from patenting traditional plant knowledge, arguing, if they took her cells without consent, what's stopping them from taking ours? But the most unexpected revival comes from Lagos, where artist Folasade Adioso's viral installation, the HeLa Project, reimagines Henrietta's cells as golden Yoruba beads, each sphere etched with the names of Black women whose DNA was later commercialized without permission. The exhibit toured London's Tate Modern with an accompanying restitution lab, where visitors could scan their own ancestry tests to see if their genetic data appears in patented research. Adioso's work exposes the uncomfortable truth: Henrietta wasn't an anomaly. She was the canary in the coal mine for a system that still profits from marginalized bodies. Even corporations are being forced to pivot. In 2024, the biotech firm Thermo Fisher, which once sold HeLa cell products for $300 per vial, settled a landmark lawsuit with Lacks' descendants. The agreement didn't just involve compensation, it mandated they fund scholarships for Black women in STEM, turning exploitation into empowerment. Similar pressures forced the National Institutes of Health to revise its genome data policies, granting families veto power over how their DNA is used. Yet the most profound shift isn't legal, it's linguistic. Medical textbooks once described HeLa cells as immortal, a term that erased the woman they came from. Now, journals like The Lancet use lax-line cells, insisting on the humanity behind the science. In Baltimore, where Henrietta's grandchildren run a community lab, high school students peer through microscopes at their great-grandmother's cells while learning to sequence their own DNA. This isn't just about the past, one teen told NPR. It's about making sure nobody owns the blueprint of me. From murals in Melbourne to genomic justice conferences in Johannesburg, Henrietta's legacy has transcended biography to become a global mirror. Each tribute asks the same unflinching question: who benefits when we separate discovery from dignity? The answer is rewriting science itself, one cell, one conscience at a time. History doesn't forget heroes by accident, it follows a script written by the hands of power. Look closely at the 35 figures we've uncovered, and you'll notice the same erasure patterns repeating like a sinister refrain. Gender, race, class, these aren't just details in their stories, they're the knives that scrape their names from the record. Take the women: Agnotis, Mary Anning, Fanny Mendelssohn. Their brilliance wasn't lost to time, it was smothered by societies that couldn't fathom intelligence in a woman's body. Anning's fossils were displayed in museums as natural curiosities, while male geologists took credit for interpreting them. Mendelssohn's compositions were literally rebranded as her brother's work because the 19th century music world refused to believe a woman could orchestrate such complexity. The message was clear: women could inspire but never invent, assist but never lead. Race sharpened the blade. Figures like Granville T. Woods and Rebecca Lee Crumpler didn't just face indifference, they battled a system that erased their contributions to uphold the myth of white superiority. Woods's patents were stolen because America needed to believe black minds couldn't engineer progress. Crumpler's medical textbook was dismissed as folk medicine, not because her science was flawed, but because admitting a black woman had mastered physiology would have shattered the racial hierarchy. Even triumphs were twisted. Toussaint Louverture's revolution was recast as a bloody uprising rather than a strategic masterclass because acknowledging black leadership threatened colonialism's justification. Class was the silent accomplice. Working-class heroes like Mary Anning and Sybil Ludington lacked the wealth to print their own narratives or hire biographers. Anning's discoveries funded aristocratic collections, while her name vanished from exhibit labels. Ludington's ride was ignored because history belonged to those who could afford quills and printing presses, not farm girls with mud on their shoes. The elite wrote the rules of remembrance, and they ensured the working class stayed off the page. But the most insidious erasure wasn't just exclusion, it was distortion. Take Alan Turing. The British government didn't merely forget him, they recast him as a criminal, his sexuality deemed more scandalous than his wartime heroism. Or Pauli Murray, erased from feminist and civil rights movements because their gender non-conforming identity didn't fit either group's tidy narrative. History doesn't just omit, it rewrites, turning radicals into footnotes and turning footnotes into blank spaces. Why does this matter now? Because every time we accept the official story, we inherit those biases. When textbooks call Edison the father of electricity, but reduce Granville Woods to a tinkerer, we're taught to equate genius with whiteness. When medical schools celebrate Hippocrates but skip Rebecca Crumpler, we learn whose knowledge counts. These aren't gaps in history, they're fracture lines, and the cracks still shape who we value today. The good news: patterns can be broken. Look at how Bayard Rustin's queerness was once scrubbed from civil rights history. Now his face graces US postage stamps. Or Henrietta Lacks, once anonymized as HeLa, now memorialized by the World Health Organization. Their restorations prove history isn't fixed, it's a battleground. Every time we drag a buried name into the light, we're not just correcting the past, we're rewriting the rules of who gets remembered tomorrow, because the greatest threat to injustice isn't anger, it's memory. And some stories refuse to stay buried. The fight to reclaim these lost histories isn't just happening in dusty archives or academic journals. It's unfolding in the digital age, where technology and activism are colliding to resurrect names that were nearly erased. Take the Women in Science Wikipedia edit-a-thons, where volunteers gather to create or expand entries for figures like Emily Du Chatelet and Mary Anning, battling the site's notorious gender gap one keystroke at a time. In 2023 alone, over 4,000 new profiles of forgotten female scientists were added, many translated into dozens of languages. But this isn't just about filling gaps, it's about rewriting algorithms. When Google's search results prioritized pop stars over physicists, coders at the Artemis project hacked back, flooding the system with meticulously sourced content about women like Agnotis until her name auto-completed faster than some celebrity gossip. Documentaries are turning these rescues into emotional blockbusters. The PBS series Unladylike, narrated by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, doesn't just profile figures like journalist Ida B. Wells, it reconstructs their worlds through animation, splicing rare interview audio with reenactments voiced by descendants. One episode features Granville T. Wood's great-niece demonstrating his railroad telegraph with a working replica, the sparks flying as she asks, how many more inventions are buried in unmarked graves? Meanwhile, platforms like Netflix and the BBC are investing in biopics that refuse to sanitize history. Their recent film on Alan Turing didn't shy away from his chemical castigation, forcing audiences to confront how Britain treated the man who saved it. Grassroots efforts are even more inventive. In Ghana, the Adinkra archive uses augmented reality to overlay forgotten heroes like Queen Nanny onto colonial-era maps, her guerrilla tactics animated alongside British troop movements. In New Orleans, a street artist collective paints murals of Henrietta Lacks on hospital walls, her face dissolving into cells that glow under black light, a reminder to every passing doctor of medicine's unpaid debts. And in Seoul, an eye called Project Echo scours centuries of texts for overlooked names, recently identifying 600 Korean women scientists whose inventions were credited to male relatives. The most poignant work happens in classrooms. A Florida teacher's shadow history's curriculum has students fact-check their own textbooks, comparing passages about figures like Sybil Ludington with primary sources. One assignment went viral when a teen uncovered that Paul Revere's ride was front-loaded in the curriculum while Ludington's was a single footnote, a bias baked into lesson plans since the 1950s. Now her students lobby state boards to rebalance the narrative, armed with annotated muster rolls and pension records. Even corporations are being dragged into the reckoning. After pressure from historians, the Royal Society revised its online exhibits to highlight how it excluded women like Mary Anning, while the U.S. Patent Office now marks filings stolen from black inventors like Woods with digital disclaimers. But the real power lies in projects like Harvard's Freedmen's Bureau papers, where crowdsourced transcription unlocked millions of names, including Harriet Robinson Scott's freedom suit previously buried in unsearchable cursive. What unites these efforts isn't just nostalgia, it's justice. Every time a teenager Googles Fanny Mendelssohn and finds her symphony streaming on Spotify, or a doctor reads Rebecca Lee Crumpler's textbook scans uploaded by the National Library of Medicine, the past isn't just remembered. It's repaired because history isn't a static record, it's a battleground. And for the first time, the voices silenced for centuries have algorithms, documentaries, and even graffiti guns fighting on their side. The irony, technology, once a tool of erasure, is now the shovel digging them up, and some stories, once unearthed, refuse to be reburied. But here's the thing, history's gaps aren't just in textbooks. They're hiding in plain sight, in the stories your grandparents whispered over coffee, in the local legends your town never bothered to monument, maybe even in the family album tucked away in your attic. Every single one of us carries shards of forgotten brilliance waiting for someone to piece them together, so let's turn the spotlight to you. Who's the unsung hero from your world, the inventor, the activist, the artist, the everyday rebel whose name deserves to echo beyond the walls of memory? Think about the woman who taught your village to read when no school would open its doors, or the uncle who jury-rigged a radio to broadcast truth during a dictatorship. Maybe it's the labor organizer whose strikes won your factory fair wages but whose face never made the papers. History isn't just made by the famous, it's stitched together by people like them, people like yours. And here's where the real excavation begins. Drop their names in the comments. Tell us why they mattered. Was it the engineer in Lagos who built a windmill from scrap metal? The Cherokee botanist who preserved healing herbs colonizers tried to erase? The great aunt who smuggled poems out of prison? This isn't just a comment section, it's a rebellion against forgetting. Every time you post a name, you're scribbling them back into existence. And who knows, the story you share might collide with someone else's fragment, revealing a pattern we've missed for centuries. Like the time a viewer in Lisbon mentioned their great-grandmother's hidden suffragette pamphlets only for a historian in Brazil to recognize them as part of a global network no textbook had ever connected. That's the magic of crowdsourced memory. It's messy, alive, and louder than any archive. So don't hold back. Dig up the family lore, the local legends, that's just how grandma was, stories that quietly defy the status quo. Because history isn't a finished book, it's a draft we're all editing together, and the next footnote might just be yours. These 35 heroes were never just individuals, they were seismic shocks, cracking open the world's assumptions about who gets to shape history. Look at their collective footprint: medicine transformed by Agnidas's courage, civil rights redefined by Bayard Rustin's strategy, music rewritten by Fanny Mendelssohn's genius. Each was a thread pulled from the fabric of their time, revealing how much tighter and richer the weave could have been had they not been snipped away. But here's the unsettling truth: for every name we've resurrected, there are thousands still buried. The librarian who catalogued their stories wasn't impartial, it was power wielding its eraser with brutal precision. Consider what we lose when history is a monologue instead of a chorus. Without Mary Anning, we miss the thrill of discovery that belongs to working-class women. Without Granville T. Wood's innovation seems like the birthright of only certain faces. And without Pauli Murray, the civil rights movement appears simpler, sanitized, less queer, less radical, less true. These aren't just gaps, they're chasms that distort our understanding of human potential itself. The danger isn't merely that we've forgotten. It's that we've been taught to see these omissions as normal, as if greatness only comes in familiar packages. Yet the most subversive lesson these heroes offer isn't about the past, it's about now. Every time you scroll through news feeds or skim history books, ask whose breakthroughs are being dismissed today as hobbies or luck. Whose protests are being labeled riots while others get called revolutions. The patterns haven't vanished, they've just evolved. Look at how quickly the architects of Black Lives Matter or Me Too were both celebrated and caricatured, their complexities sanded down to fit palatable narratives. History isn't done erasing, so where do we go from here? Start by hunting the absences. When you hear phrases like "the first woman to" or "the only black inventor who," dig deeper. There's always a precursor, someone scrubbed from the record to make the first seem more dramatic. Visit local archives, challenge textbook narratives, and crucially amplify the work of historians from marginalized communities who are rebuilding these stories brick by brick. Because reclaiming lost heroes isn't nostalgia, it's reconnaissance for a fairer future. And remember, this isn't the end. For every tale we've uncovered, there are countless others waiting in the shadows. The Haitian midwives who developed life-saving techniques during slavery, the queer writers of the Harlem Renaissance forced into pseudonyms, the indigenous engineers whose sustainable cities were bulldozed for colonial myths. Their stories matter not as footnotes, but as compass points guiding us toward a history that's finally big enough for all its heroes. If this journey through the overlooked has stirred something in you, don't let it stop here. Hit subscribe because this channel is a dig site for forgotten brilliance. Together, we'll keep unearthing the names they tried to bury, one extraordinary life at a time. After all, the past isn't set in stone, it's written in whispers, and it's time we turned up the volume.